Welcome back to College Football Addiction. I've got Jake Hatch on here, locked on BYU. Man, how you doing, bud?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you for taking some time and chatting with us today. Um, right now at 7-0, we'll talk a little big picture, then we'll talk about this UCF game. But anyway, well, I'll back up some. I was in Dublin for Florida State, Georgia Tech, and then on the flight back, I'm watching SMU play, and SMU nearly loses to Nevada. And it's making me feel better about Florida State, to be honest with you. And then, shortly after that, SMU does lose to BYU, and everybody's like, man, SMU is just not for real. Like, how could you almost lose to Nevada, almost lose to, or you do lose to BYU in a weird game. It was like 18-15, and now it has come full circle to where people are like, well, we lost to BYU. That's a pretty good loss at this point in the SMU world. Obviously, a really big win against Kansas State as well. And then, favorites to, win the rest of their games. Now you got to go out and win each one, right? Like being a 3-point favorite every week isn't necessarily easy. But then favorites to go to the Big 12 championship and win that too. Just can you even put into perspective like where this first half and a game of the season has been for BYU?
It's come out of seemingly nowhere. That's the crazy thing about this is BYU has been rolling for so long, and they've been doing so many things that have been so out of the norm for what we saw last year for the first year in the Big 12. This is a BYU team that offensively struggled to gain traction in the ground game a year ago. The defense was sub 100 in a number of major categories. They were dead last in the Power Four in overall sacks a season ago. And this year, they've kind of flipped all of that on its head. They're getting all kinds of pressure on the opposing quarterbacks. They've got a bevy of sacks, tackles for loss. They've had an uptick in their run game. Just this past week against Oklahoma State, they tallied 250-plus yards on the ground. So it's kind of crazy how things have gone. But I can tell you, Cougar fans, they're more than ecstatic to have BYU doing what they're doing.
How do you think the staff has and will continue to prepare them for the expectations of winning, right? Like early in the year, I think it's easy to say like, hey guys, just go out and play your heart. But like now everybody expects BYU to win every week. And so how difficult of a job is that for BYU staff?
Well, the thing is, Kalani Sitake and his staff have used a phrase that's kind of getting ingrained in Cougar fans' heads. It's be humble, be hungry. And that's been the whole mantra around this team right now is despite the fact that they're 7-0, they are still maintaining a focus on the here and now. They know that they have goals of winning the Big 12 title, maybe going to the college football playoff, all that stuff that's out there in the future. But they understand if they don't take this on a week-by-week approach and win, as you mentioned, every game, every week, that's not going to be a reality for them at the end of the season. So they're just approaching it from a workmanlike perspective, and I think that shows in the way that they've been playing football so far.
So I've got one more, and then we'll move on to the game against UCF. But a tough game on Friday night where they had to come back, a thrilling game. I stayed up late and watched after I was disappointed again in my team on Friday night, but stayed up late and watched this and was excited for it. So get the comeback win against Oklahoma State. But with anything, if you're measured, was it, are there some concerns coming out of that, or is it just like, hey, man, we were just happy to get the win? Or what is your 30,000-foot thoughts on the Oklahoma State game?
Obviously a thrilling win to engineer a last-minute drive that had a minute 13 to work with and went right down the field and scored with 10 seconds to go. That's absolutely incredible. 75 yards for the win. You'll always take that. But there are concerns. Oklahoma State ran for 269 yards on BYU in this game. And that's a major concern. The BYU's rush defense may be faltering a bit here because that was a big issue a season ago. They just seemingly couldn't stop anybody from running it right down their throat. And Ollie Gordon had his best performance by far of the season for Oklahoma State in that win. And the concern is they get ready for UCF this week. Well, R.J. Harvey and the Knights, they run it as well as any option team out there in the entire country. I've seen them go for 350-plus seemingly every week. So BYU's got some concern that the rush defense has got to be improved because it's been pretty good up to this past game. But if it's going to falter like it did against Oklahoma State, that could be a major point of concern against a team like UCF.
Yeah, UCF played Iowa State really well last week, and kind of the same thing. Gave up, kind of pulled an Oklahoma State, right? Pulled a last second kind of failure from the jaws of defeat or from the jaws of victory, I guess. But thoughts on just UCF being kind of a desperate team right now, like losing 3 in a row, getting embarrassed by Colorado, losing to Florida, feeling like they had a chance against Iowa State and blowing that. Just Thoughts on UCF kind of being the desperate team that maybe needs this more and having to go on the road and play that?
I absolutely agree that they're desperate because they've had a lot of close calls. As you mentioned, Iowa State most recently. Same scoreline as BYU, 38-35, and Iowa State and BYU had engineered last-minute, last-gasp drives to win those respective games. So, yeah, they're going to feel a little bit hard done by, speaking of the Knights, and they are going to be thinking, hey, we got to get back to 500, and there's no better time than the present to go and upset BYU. Obviously, the Cougars got to make the trip. It's 2 time zones out to the eastern time zone from Mountain Time, and that can affect body clocks and the like. So, if I'm UCF, I'm absolutely thinking, yeah, we're the more desperate team. We need this W. But I know that BYU, their coaches, the people inside the program, they'll be preaching the exact same thing to their guys, saying, hey, the best part about being 7-0 is we have a chance to go to 8-0 and continue to show the world that we are much better than we were anticipated being.
So I want to ask you about RJ Harvey, but first let's talk about BYU. And just for maybe somebody that's on the national scale that's not been tuned in to a ton of BYU football, no shots at the Cougars, but people maybe before the season didn't think they'd be watching much BYU football. But now certainly a team that everyone seems to want to tune into. Who are the difference makers that you could kind of expect to have a pretty good game, or maybe an X factor or two in this game this weekend?
Well, number one's their quarterback, Jake Retzloff. He had such a negative vibe about him coming out of last season. They were 0-4 with him as the starter down the stretch last year, and all he's done this year is engineer a 7-0 start to the season. He's been absolutely marvelous. He's led BYU in passing and rushing in multiple games this year because of the injuries to BYU's running backs. And the nice part is they've got the full complement of running backs back finally, so that obviously should give them a better opportunity to run the ball much better, hopefully against UCF. But he's absolutely an X factor. If he plays as well as we've seen him play at points this year, he can elevate this BYU team. Another guy on the offense I'll mention just real quick is LJ Martin, their star running back. Had his best performance of his career this past week, 120 yards, averaging in north of 6 yards per carry. Really impressed with him. He looks the part of the next. You've seen Jamal Williams, Tyler Algier come through here, just some recent backs that some of your listeners may know that are now playing in the NFL. Well, LJ looks like the next guy that could be what is a long legacy of very good running backs for BYU. Flipping over to the defense, I would look at 2 guys, 2 linebackers, Isaiah Glasker and Jack Kelly. They play they call it a rover position and then the weak side backer respectively. And both of them are they've been revelations this year. The ability to cover in a space, to rush the quarterback, get sacks, make game-changing plays. They have flashed all of that. And if they can continue to do that, BYU's defense is going to be as good as it needs to be a difference maker this year. But the question is, can they make those plays on the road against UCF on Saturday?
Yeah, you mentioned RJ Harvey a second ago, and a kid that other teams have had some success slowing down. Colorado did a good job of saying like, hey, we're going to put Travis Hunter out on your best wide receiver. Now nobody else has a Travis Hunter in college football. I get that, but it's a really unfair comparison. But then even Florida's got a good cornerback in Jason Marshall, and they put him out there on that island and said like, yep, we're going to stack the box and not do this. And RJ had a little bit better game this week, no doubt. But what is your confidence level in BYU being able to bounce back after Ollie's performance last week, and maybe nobody stops RJ, but slow him down a little bit?
I think that they were put on notice last week. The way BYU's defense performed, I'm sure that their coaches are ripping into them in film review on Monday and obviously telling them, guys, you sucked, quite frankly. You gave up 270 yards rushing. That's not a good performance. I know that Jay Hill, BYU's defensive coordinator, his whole philosophy is predicated on, number one, slowing down or shutting down the opposing rushing attack, and they failed in that regard on Friday against Oklahoma State. So, yeah, I think they got a wake-up call that, hey, maybe you're not necessarily as good as you thought you were on defense, and you're going to have to perform much better against UCF. Ja'Cory Brown, I believe, is in line to get the start once again at quarterback, and him and RJ Harvey is a 1-2 tandem in that backfield, along with all the other athletes that UCF boasts. That's going to be a hard thing to slow down, but BYU has to be ready to slow that down if at all possible.
Yeah. ESPN actually says that UCF is a favorite in this. Now, I don't think FPI is the end-all be-all, but they've got them as just over the coin flip. Like, I know it's 3 points in Vegas. It's 55% on ESPN. Does that surprise you a little bit that, ESPN considers UCF a slight favorite here?
It does and it doesn't. Here's the thing: BYU has been they've been very good against the spread all season long, but a lot of it has been they've been the underdog in many respects. And I know that Kalani Sitake and his guys, they love being able to play up the disrespect card with this team and motivate them that way. So that'll absolutely be something that they utilize. I think that they're looking at it from the FPI perspective, and I think most people, if you look at metrics, BYU has overperformed relative to their stats and just the overall projections of what they're capable of accomplishing. And a lot of it's come down to the fact that they've forced a number of turnovers and have turned those into short fields, and the offense has cashed in those for touchdowns. That's a big key to why BYU's where they're at right now. So, yeah, I can understand why the FPI and some of these projections still have BYU potentially losing on the road, because I just think that the numbers bear out that BYU's overperforming relative to what the numbers actually indicate they should be doing.
We talked a little about RJ. We talked a little bit about the defense. What is there one? We talked about the time zones. Is there one thing in this game, maybe outside of RJ Harvey and stopping the run, that concerns you for BYU?
I think the biggest thing is you look at how BYU performs on the Eastern time zone historically. Not so good. Now, in their independent era before they joined the Big 12, BYU played on the eastern side of the country a lot, and they got better at playing in the Eastern time zone, but it is still a struggle because, like I said, it's two time zones, and the metrics bear out. You look at the Big Ten, some of the West Coast teams, also teams come from the traditional Big Ten footprint, having to travel across the country, vice versa. It's affecting those teams' performances, and BYU is not immune to that. So I do have some concern that BYU, even though they're going out early to acclimatize as best they can, it's still going to affect them a little bit. I'm actually glad it's not a 10 a.m. body clock game here for BYU at noon Eastern. It's actually 3:30 Eastern, so 1:30 is much more manageable on BYU's players' body clocks. But just the history suggests BYU does struggle on the East Coast, and that could be a concern as they make that trip down to Orlando.
I don't know that he would do BYU any favors, but maybe they can call Coach Prime and try and figure out what the heck they did. Although I guess with tiebreakers and everything else, they probably would prefer UCF to win this thing. So, all right, most concerned. What are you most confident in? Like, what would you like if you got to go bet the mortgage? I guess. What are you going to say? Like BYU is going to do this well on Saturday, and it's probably going to be the reason they win if they do.
I'm confident in BYU's passing game. You mentioned some of the X factors. I probably should have mentioned their two-star receivers in Darius Lassiter and Chase Roberts. They're a 1-2 tandem that gets themselves open. If one guy gets doubled up, the other guy seems to find himself in a one-on-one. He's going to make himself available to a guy like Jake Retzloff. I'm confident that BYU's passing game will travel well down there to Orlando, and it should perform well, and it'll give BYU a fighting chance. Even if the run game maybe struggles a little bit, kind of a regression to the mean, as it were, this week after they went for 250 plus last week, I think BYU's passing game, which struggled at points against Oklahoma State, will bounce back, and that will give them a fighting chance in this one.
Jake, I appreciate you a ton for hanging out. Where can people follow you? Where can they find more of your work?
Follow me on X or Twitter. I'm at Jacob C. Hatch. If you want all my thoughts on BYU, I do a podcast every day called Locked On BYU Cougars. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. Also available on YouTube, and you can search out the show on social media as well. Locked On Cougars on Facebook, Instagram, and also Twitter/X.
Awesome. What's your prediction in this one?
I'm going to go BYU. I've got them 34-28 BYU. Let's go with that one. How about that?
I like it. I'd lean by BYU too. Again, UCF I feel like is desperate. Sometimes that gets crazy, but I also think they're on their fourth quarterback so far this year. So it's still spooky with the Halloween week. I guess I'm using a good pun there, but it is still spooky with the option stuff. But I like BYU here too. So Jake, I appreciate you, man, for hanging out. Good luck this weekend.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.